to notify you that you can select your preferred language here in Zoom at the bottom down below. اللي حابين يسمعون الحوار باللغة العربية ممكن أن أنتم تختارون تحت اللغة المفضلة أسفل الشاشة. At the bottom bar also you can find the Q&A tab. So drop us your question throughout the talk and we'll try to answer a few of them at the end of our talk. And you can also find us streaming live on YouTube. So if that's your preferred channel, feel free to watch us at Shuruq SHJ. As cities grow, the need for critical elements of urban infrastructure, such as mobility stations, event spaces, and sport venues increase. Such buildings are often utilized in a given period of time, some of them not even reaching their full potential, particularly after the event takes place. City planners, designers, and clients often face the challenge of maximizing the value of investment and integrating these buildings more into the city. So with us here to discuss designing after temporary, I would like to welcome Mr. Keith Brewis, International Managing Partner at GRIMSHAW, and Mr. Andrew Ardill, Director at Hopkins Architecture Dubai Studio. Thank you for joining us in this session. And before we jump right into it, maybe you can introduce yourself and your work a bit more. We can start with Keith.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be involved in this event. I suppose my interest and background, I've been at GRIMSHAW now for over 25 years. I've predominantly worked on transport and infrastructure buildings, and worked really internationally, worked globally. I've spent quite a few years living in Australia, and have lived in Hong Kong as well. But I'm currently resident in the UK. I think as I've sort of matured as an architect, I've become, in a way, more interested, I suppose, in the sort of integration of primary public buildings within urbanism, and as well, I suppose, the concerns that we all have at the moment for the planet and the impact of kind of human activity. And so I think the idea that buildings in many ways can be as gentle as they can be and as long lasting as they can be is really pivotal to me. So I think as I'm getting older, I'm becoming more of a urban ecologist, I think, but we'll see how that plays out.
I'm sure it's going to play out very well. So, Andrew?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. My name is Andrew Ardill. I'm representing Hopkins Architects. We are a UK firm, but we've had an office in the Middle East for work there for 20 years now, so getting a reasonable time. We tend to do a wide range of projects, and I think relevant to this topic is the fact that when you do buildings like stadia, like theatre, they come with quite a specific set of requirements, but if you want to respond in a sustainable way, it's about trying to get more use out of it, trying to see other ways that they can be used, and that's something I can talk about later. Some of the projects that we've done in the Middle East, I'm based there. Initially, DIFC Gate Village. More recently, we've been very fortunate to work both on the Expo 2020 thematic districts, and also for His Highness the Ruler's Office of Sharjah in the Brewis Geological Park and the Sharjah Exhibition Centre.
Thank you. I said that probably 2 weeks ago, but the Brewis project is one of my favorites.
Thank you.
So yeah, let's just start basically. I want to know your opinion to, when designing such buildings that we're specifically talking about today, airports, stadiums, theaters, all of these, big infrastructure buildings. How does the architect seek to deliver value in addition to a good return of investment, given that according to a report published by Klaus Main, only 20% of the lifetime cost of a building lies in the construction cost. Most of it goes to operations and maintenance and that sort of thing. So how do you think about it as an architect when you approach, designing this type of buildings? Keith, do you want to go first?
Yeah, look, I think there's a very straightforward answer to that, but it's a very difficult thing to accomplish. I think beyond the client's brief, I think as an architect, the sort of more experienced you become, the more that you're able, on behalf of the client and potentially on behalf of society, to see, if you like, the opportunity of the building over and above the absolute brief for the building. And I think there are a lot of societal trends that we are very well aware of, I think, as experienced architects, that you can introduce into the design that take the design way beyond its immediate requirement. I mean, very often I think we find that clients are trying to, obviously, because these buildings are formidable, very often they're extraordinarily complex and they're a very real scale. Clients, quite understandably, are trying to constrain the building, to control the cost, to control the program, and to understand, in many ways, the simplest and most immediate requirements for it. But I think as an architect, you need to expand those knowingly and to be responsible with that, and therefore to kind of make sure that there's a built-in resilience and a built-in sort of adaptability for these great investments.
Yeah, adaptability is definitely a key word here. Andrew, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, perhaps I'll just share my screen. I just wanted to talk over a couple of images, if that was okay. So I assume you can see my screen, yes? There's two projects that I thought were just worth making some points on. We did an opera house in the countryside of Sussex in the UK in the 90s, quite some time ago. And just to respond to your point, I think there's about 2 or 3 key things that architects can do to get more out of these buildings, because they do have specific events. These events run at certain times, and there's always an issue with the client as to how can you get more out of the area. I think the first important thing is about placemaking. And what that means is it should be an experience or an event to come to these areas, be it a theatre, be it a stadium. And that requires a close collaboration between the developer and architect to say, well, what other things can we offer? Can we give in the surrounding area a nice set of mixed use events? So in this example in Glyndebourne, it's about an outing to the countryside. People go there not just for world-class opera, but they also go there to have an engagement with the countryside, to have a restaurant experience, very fresh restaurant experience. There is a connection with wildlife. All these kind of themes build up to make it a place to visit. It's a similar way that perhaps Buhace, as you mentioned, is an experience in geology. These are about experiences of the countryside or an experience of local culture. And I think the second important thing about these buildings is, as Keith said, adaptability is key. And in a lot of cases, that can be down to creating flexible space, but also making sure that the buildings themselves are made from long-lasting, durable materials, ones that last and weather over time, and importantly, over several years, allow you to change the building, to modernize it, to recreate uses, to respond. And that's in a similar way, perhaps, to the Velodrome project that we did in 2012, where it's not only seen as an object of the Olympics, but it has to be repurposed. And it's a very specific brief when you're designing for, say, a cycling area. But the connecting activities of it after the event, it becomes a health park. It's about encouraging people to exercise, to book the space for not just professional cycling, but mountain biking, different events. That space can be used for different things. So that, in a nutshell, was just a couple of thoughts in terms of how essentially crystallizing it into 3 points. Make sure your materials are long lasting. So the building is a considerable expense. It lasts for several decades. Make sure you've got a good mix around it so that it's active and engaged. People go there. They do tend to be on, in some cases, away from the center of the city. So it has to have other facilities to support it, to make people want to go there. And the third thing, that core aspect of adaptability, making sure that if it needs to be repurposed at a later date, from say a theatre to a concert hall or a stadium to an exhibition area, it can do that.
I like that. So the formula is, just like you were saying, having durable buildings and a good mix and flexibility, I guess. Sounds good. It's a good formula. So you mentioned also the expo, Dubai Expo. And the Dubai Expo is this huge, amazing monster of structures that often when you go there and you wonder, like, what's happening next? How are these buildings utilized to their full capacity? And when the expo is over, what happens beyond that? I think you worked on the thematic district, as you were saying. And then Keith Grimshaw as well, the sustainability pavilion. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to
you go
start if you wish, Keith. Yeah. Again, I'm just going to share a couple of images. I think it's always useful to just talk over something to give people some context to this. So the expo is something very important for the UAE, and I think one of the good things about the leadership and the decision making of the expo was that right from day one, they were saying to us, you must think about the use after expo. Expo's only going to last 6 months. What are we going to use these buildings for after that? So when you have the full support, that right from the moment you're about to start on a project, you have to think, crikey, what is this going to be for the next 50, 70 years? It slightly changes your mindset. You start to think, well, what is the formula for creating flexible spaces internally and externally that can adapt and change over time, but also create something very characterful and very memorable for the expo event? And I think in terms of the project that we did, I mean, just to add a little bit of context to this. So this is the expo, an image of the expo mode with pavilions around the edges, but this core area in the middle of the 3 petals here and here and here, these are permanent buildings. They were commissioned by Expo 2020. The thematic districts is this area here, these nearly 90 buildings. And there are some core theme pavilions at the ends. There's Keith's sustainability pavilion and the other 2, mobility and opportunity. But when it grows into city after the event, the idea was to create buildings where there are a couple of flexible types, quite simple spaces. It has a very efficient structure. It allows for adaptation and change. These 90 buildings in expo mode can be any exhibition space, but in legacy mode, they become different functions. As it happens at the minute, some of the areas will be residential and some of the areas will be commercial, but they could change and swap around. And the ingredient with that is creating flexible, durable buildings, similar to what I just mentioned about in the Opera House and in the Velodrome, but in Expo it's even more so. We have characterful buildings. In Expo mode, we've applied this a characterful wrap that you can see here. But what's actually behind that wrap, and this allows countries to personalize the buildings for themselves, is a more permanent legacy facade. And that legacy facade is for offices, it's for residential buildings, it's for a variety of different experiences. Could be medical buildings, it could be basically any type of building. And you achieve that by creating very simple, clear spans, making it very durable. This is an example of how one of the spaces, very early stage conceptually, could be for an exhibition space. It's just a very wide, clear span space internally, but giving the client the opportunity to open up the structure so that you can create double height spaces, allowing this sort of loose fit architecture, so you can put meeting rooms, offices, different pods in the space. It becomes part of the character of the architecture as well. And it attracts this kind of innovative companies to come to personalize the space in ways that they wish. And that was very much what they wanted. And when you think about it, it's actually concrete structure with a nice precast facade, and inside, which is quite free and spacious to allow for this personalization. So quite a simple formula. Then the public realm, we wanted to make sure that it was long lasting and part of a sense of space and place. And I think when one uses native and adaptive plants and looks at the historic precedents of the UAE in terms of the courtyard space, the fact that it's enjoyable to walk in the city and how that can inform the character of the district, it becomes something that reinforces the legacy. It's very easy to change between the two of them. So we were trying to create lots of different options for the client. They can have small buildings, they can join buildings together like this. And in doing that, we create this very long-lasting, adaptable development.
Look, just, I mean, a lot of that, Andrew, is, you know, I would completely agree with almost everything you said. I think everything you said. Almost, I suppose, our work at Expo is unusually, and I'll just share a couple of images quickly as well. Let's see if this works. So just now focusing on the sustainability pavilion. So in many ways, what we have done for this particular building, albeit I'm sure that I'm going to return in this discussion about the notion of flexibility and adaptability, is actually to say that this building is something actually quite distinct from that. This was meant to be almost an infamous building which set out to, as much as it could, exist off-grid. So it tries to create its own power as a demonstration as to how difficult that is. And it tries, to an extent, create its own water, and it certainly recycles all of the water that it consumes and uses. But I think one of the really interesting things, and it does build on some of the things that both of us are speaking to, is that it's important to create an opportunity where the cultural program of the building can flex over time. This building will be a permanently retained structure, and the client has certainly hardened up the Expo client has hardened up on the intention there. And I think a lot of that was to do with our initial proposal that said, in many ways, if the UAE was to become infamous and to become a game changer for sort of the life after Expo, what might this be about? And it could be about a kind of a very strong sustainable future. And therefore, as part of our submission to the Expo team, as we secured the project, was to say that we could help the client to arrange a panel, a kind of a supreme committee of experts who would subscribe to the sustainability pavilion as being their kind of debating chamber, their center ground. And over the years, we assume and we hope that the sustainability pavilion becomes a kind of global center for debate about ecology, environment, and sustainability. And it attracts, the attention and becomes profoundly important, and therefore it survives and obviously creates extraordinary value and impact more broadly.
And yeah, what I particularly like about this is that you stepped out of just the architect's role and you actually wanted to implement other ideas and come up with ideas that will make that building more utilized. So that's always great. And in terms of also, given the same topic, Keith, about the architect influencing the design further than just how the structure looks like. According to the UN Environment Global Status Report published in 2017, the built environment is responsible for 40% of energy-related carbon emissions globally. And when specialized buildings are abandoned, a huge asset is left behind. And therefore, adaptive reuse offers the chance of a second life. So how does Grimshaw seek to turn 3 disused aircraft hangars into a destination?
Right. Well, let me share screen again and just jump onto this particular project, which is very close to where I'm sitting at the moment in the West Country of the UK, in Bristol. So look, I'm fascinated again by large span and by engineering and by kind of engineering prowess. This was an extraordinary aviation project conceived and built by aviation engineers in 1948 to create this kind of extraordinary transatlantic airliner that never really, it took off, but it didn't really take off because the jet engine came in and made it redundant almost as soon as it was built. Since that time, all of the UK's Concorde were built in these quite amazing hangars. But then since about 1985, they've sat redundant. They've sat kind of empty, and they're slowly starting to kind of fall apart. We were fortunate enough to pick up the commission for that in terms of the transformation of these 3 hangars, each of which is about 100-meter clear span. And the idea here, I think, is obviously to do with adaptive reuse. But again, I think as architect, we need to step way beyond our initial brief and our kind of immediate contractual obligation and think far harder about how the project can properly survive, how it can be a 24/7, 365-day-a-year project that really works for the city in terms of the city's broader economy, rather than just thinking about it as a kind of static arena place. And what we set out really to do is to think very hard about the interrelationship of programs that could be at the same time or subsequent to one another by really considering the way that the building is serviced predominantly. And then to think about how each of the spaces could flex in relationship to the other, whereby you could have a major concert happening in the center space with a festival, a music festival going on in the Eastern Hangar at the same time, and then a series of other community events or societal events happening in what we've called the hub space. And using the interstitial space between these three great event modes as the flex, and within there we can have nightclubs, events that are there in terms of food and beverage that can flex during different event modes. So the whole idea is to get these three buildings working incredibly hard by understanding and contributing to the client's program of sport and music events throughout the year. That obviously means that we need to design the arena itself and all the other parts of the building as loose fit. We can flex the arena through many different modes, from a 17,000 person maximum capacity into a space that can work in the round. We can then reduce it down entirely to a theatre mode, whereby we could actually have quite intimate events for 500 or 1,000 people at any particular moment, and then flex that into the side hangars. What we've also conceived of is an aesthetic and an architecture that is one that respects the continuum, the continuous nature, if you like, of that original structure, whereby once the arena function has finished, we can actually unclip. We can take all of the arena back out of the building. We can unplug all of the staircases and all of the air handling and cooling modes from the building and leave the building back as its original frame, which I think is a theme that is becoming more and more important. It's almost to say, what happens to the building once the building's life has finished in its current function? And I think we do have an extraordinary role as architects into that. And then just another couple of things that we've, I think, brought into the project, which has really helped, again, the client being private sector. So they're very interested in the business case for this project. It needs fundamentally to make profit. And part of that profit is really to do with land value. So the arena has been coupled very much into a broader master plan that's allowed the client to consider far greater density on the old airfield site. But that density needs to be real. There needs to be purpose to it. And therefore we've looked a lot at, if you like, a kind of an economic cultural partnership of this project with other parts of the city and more broadly into the local environment. So we've considered how the project works and influences education, how it influences aerotech industries, how it would obviously contribute and be an integral part of the culture and leisure opportunities for the city, and how it actually also connects as a trading place through the port of Bristol. And all of that has really said that the arena itself and the whole Brabazon complex, those three hangars, actually become pivotal to the sustainability of a much broader mixed-use master plan immediately on the doorstep. And instead of that being simply a kind of an element of the master plan, it becomes the catalyst for it. It becomes the kind of economic and social driver for it, because it's always lively. It's always at full kind of, it's at full energy, I think, during its life.
And I think this comes back to the formula that Andrew shared with us. All of these items are actually in the arena that you were just discussing. Durability, having a good mix around it, whether indoors or outdoors, and then the flexibility of the plug and play of the infrastructure. So yeah, I think that's the right formula to go after. So Andrew, I'd like to know your thought for when it comes to stadiums, which were often designed in the outskirts of the city, and then somehow, as you know, the urban fabric grew, the communities would live around them and work and play and everything around these huge infrastructures that are often just passed by most of the community rather than utilized. So how can these buildings become integrated within the urban fabric that surrounds it and join the public realm? And how can we give back this huge space to the community surrounding it?
It's a good question, and I think without generalizing too much, sometimes cities, especially where they have a very developed central core, they struggle to find the space, the plot of land big enough to accommodate an area for a large span structure like a stadium or a very large building, and that's possibly one of the reasons why they tend to be sited on the outskirts. And I mean, I think using the example of a mega event, the Olympics, expos, and even sports developments, a lot of initial thought, I mean, even as Keith was saying about his connecting master plan to those buildings, that's very important, that mix. Can you create a district surrounding that area of things that maybe don't necessarily get the attention, like affordable housing, for example, schools, offices and areas that people can work. For many decades now, we've often been talking to clients about creating mixed-use developments, and sometimes what you find is you get a walkable development where you've got everything in one location. You can work, live, play, go to events, experience something, but it's too expensive for the people that work there to live there. Families come from long distances out. So perhaps one of the challenges is, can you get that mix? Can you introduce into the wider master plan a balance of functions to make it more accessible? And then importantly as well, your transport is a very important thing, and that requires the backing of government in some cases, because there's a considerable expense made to create good public transport links, but that doesn't necessarily look to a developer on his business case as a viable option if they were having to pay for it. So that it's a lot of it is also to do about the vision for a city and looking several decades into the future and saying, I'm going to take this area. If it's there already, what can we do to enhance it, to make it better? And Keith showed a lovely example of that hub there. If you're starting from scratch, a bit like the Expo, how can you make that happen from day one, so that if you're making it specific for something at the start, you anticipate that it can be something afterwards. And I think as well, we are much more conscious now about sustainability, and that has a much broader term. It's not just about things like active technologies like PVs. It's more of a mindset to say, do I need to build this building like this? Does it have to be this size? Could it be subdivisible? Could it be made into something that's a completely different use type? And that's challenging when you're doing a stadium, because stadiums can be quite prescriptive. If you're doing something for football, for example, it comes with its set of rules. But you know, a couple of good examples of flexible stadiums are ones that allow you to, for example, have conferences, events, special areas, all these kind of thoughts about how you could retract the seating, make it much more flexible. These are things that are much easier to deal with if you look at it from the start of the design process, rather than sort of trying to fix it at the end. It's a very broad question. And I think one of the other important things is just to think as well about, as you mentioned, Najla, the construction cost itself isn't necessarily the largest portion of the cost of these projects. And often one thing that is overlooked is the operating costs. And things like spending a little bit more on getting the right kind of long-lasting solution to make people feel comfortable. That doesn't necessarily have to be air conditioning. That could be looking cleverly at things like how we can use the winter period in the Middle East to help make the buildings more comfortable. How we can look at materials like stone or concrete as a thermal mass to sort of balance the temperate environment. And these kind of things can be done on large scale buildings as well, like stadia, like event spaces. So it's a very sort of holistic approach, but I think the key thing I would just say, if there's one thing I'd like you to all remember from today's talk, it's always to say, well, if you're given the opportunity to work on an exciting project, say to yourself from day one, okay, what happens if in 25 years this becomes something else? Will the building change? Will it allow for that change? And that helps you to sort of change your mindset when you're thinking about how to lay it out and how to make it.
Yeah, and probably humbles the architect that has a lot of ego to how his or her building needs to be functioning. Yeah, Keith, would you like to add to that, or?
Look, I may, Nigel, turn. You asked about major buildings, and Andrew has really articulated, I think, a very comprehensive response about stadia structure. I may just push towards transport infrastructure, I think, and just speak maybe to some of the major buildings to do with railway stations and airports, which are obviously extraordinarily large investments for governments. Again, there's just a couple of slides that I might put up, but and again, there are probably only I could make a lot of points on this. I'll probably focus on a couple of things. I will pick up on the point that Andrew made, which I think is in terms of the architect challenging the client's brief. When Grimshaw picked up the opportunity to bid for Southern Cross Station in Melbourne, the government brief assumed that the predominant large areas of the station would be filtered and would be air conditioned. And we pushed back, we ultimately ignored their brief and said, you don't need to do that. If you think properly about the majority of the days within Melbourne that are temperate, and you make sure that for the majority of the days, the building is comfortable under that temperate condition, and then the building has to work at an extreme level for some of the extreme days, and you may be a little bit uncomfortable in those extreme days, that is surely better than having a huge energy demand on the building forever. And so we persuaded them to go out and build a demonstrable building here, which is really a railway station that is entirely derived by building physics. It's actually the relationship of the building to thermal movement and to the prevailing air conditions. So we're really trying to get air movement within the building, whether it's stiflingly hot and still outside and therefore using a thermal chimney, or whether it's blowing a strong warm wind and you're actually just drawing that in and making sure that there is ventilation across the space. So I completely subscribe to what Andrew has said, that we absolutely need to challenge, I think, and be very conscious about energy consumption. The 2 points I suppose I was going to make to do with railway stations and airports is that railway stations need, I think, to properly evolve within the city, where they're not just places that you alight and depart from trains, but actually what they are very important reference points within the city, and they're extraordinarily important. They have a great catalytic impact. They derive great population density, and therefore they have great land value in and around them. But the really important thing is to make sure that they are therefore completely integrated rather than separated from the streets that surround them. And the three examples on here, so Southern Cross Station, I kind of devoted 6 years of my life to this, but the main moves, albeit people can look at it as a piece of engineering expressive architecture, for me the important moves it made were actually to do with its urban response, whereby we adjusted the way that the railway lines and the platforms and the concourses worked so that it seamlessly integrated into the city, and therefore its life could stimulate the life in and around the building. And that's very much the same as London Bridge Station, where the majority of our interest and investment was actually about the connectedness underneath and through the station, knowing that, of course, we had to deal with the railway architecture itself. And then the current work that we're doing at Euston Station as part of the terminus for high-speed rail, or HS2 within the UK, is really to make sure that the station almost is kind of exploded, that there are many entrances, many connectors, that it's entirely integrated, and that the city in many ways completely fuses through the station, over and above it, and kind of interconnects, and that you get the great benefit of, if you like, the placement of the station and what the station does in terms of this great hotbed of activity to drive a new investment economy in and around that area. So, you know, the image on the left, so you can see the kind of the roof and the expressive roof, which is really just a piece of physics. But for me, the really important thing was how does the city just seamlessly walk through the station. And it's really wonderful actually to watch people who have got no interest in catching trains using the station as a cut through. And because it's a great space to walk through, and it's comfortable and it's kind of exciting. And the same is very much true, and it's much easier at London Bridge because the station sits above you. And I think what we're seeing within airports is something quite similar. The work that we were doing at Heathrow, which we hope will start again soon, was really having an attitude towards the airport that says, you know, the moment that you get off the aeroplane, you should feel like you're in the city that you're visiting. That actually the airport isn't just a port or a kind of a terminus, a processing place. It's actually the place of the city and of the nation. And so what we're starting to do is to develop this kind of attitude when you are at the airport, let's say Heathrow in this instance, you've already arrived in Britain and you're already getting the experience, the feeling of the landscape, the feeling of the climate, the feeling of the culture, you know, the way that Britain and London works right there in the body of the airport, rather than the airport being a kind of a separated processing entity. And I think that's the natural responsibility, or I think that is the explicit actually responsibility of the architect. That there is great integration of these very complex buildings into the very fabric of the kind of the urban place that they are part of.
I definitely agree with you, and this is one thing that I was thinking about when you visit the stations during rush hour. It's crowded. There's a lot of people, and then by the time it's like close to nighttime or midnight, it gets very slow and quiet, and you see people going away from it, a lot of them. So it's nice to see that they are actually used as connection, or used, you know, in something that's additional, more than just a station, so that people are also invited to pass through or just spend some time there. It definitely adds to the building's function, I feel. So since we're talking about stations, Andrew, I wanted to know your thoughts about this, and then maybe Keith also, you can add to that. We're currently witnessing, as we all know, behavioral change when it comes to mass transportation due to the current situation. So now that we have all these lessons learned and we see how people react in a pandemic, for example, so how can architecture be more adaptive and proactive as well towards future shocks when designing public transport stations?
I think it's also a good point. I mean, as it was just discussed, I think Keith and yourself mentioned that it's an interesting architectural typology, especially a large train station or an airport, because especially for central city train stations, they tend to have certain times where they might be very busy and other times where they might not. And in some cases, that can be a marked difference. So thinking temporarily about the unfortunate situation with COVID and how one might deal with situations that arise in the future that you need to keep separate. We certainly have the space. I mean, these are very big buildings and they can easily accommodate separation. They need managed, of course. And as ever, I'm the optimist. I mean, I'm assuming hopefully a year from now, we'll see the end of COVID and it will be more about getting back.
Before a year from now.
Indeed. But it'll be about getting back to that nice human quality of getting closer, getting to smaller groups. And there is something very exciting about that idea of you've got a very large station and you've got this wonderful opportunity to connect the building, but also you've got this nice opportunity to have different restaurant experiences, opportunities for shopping, even gyms, entertainment venues, everything in one location. So it's moving away from possibly, one would say, this 20th century approach of I'll design my airport here and I'll design my shopping center here and I'll design my other thing here. You've got these long inhospitable walks to something which is much more humane and merged and something that responds more to how we all like to interact as humans, which is quite simple, really. It's about, I think, creating intimate spaces. And when you have large structures, you can still do that. It's about what's inside those spaces. Do they have interesting smaller sub areas? A bit like a very nice intimate street that one might walk down, where it's got lots of offerings and opportunities. That can be sort of a subspace of these larger areas. So that, in a way, responds. You've got the need for a big area for all the trains, but you've also got this nice breakdown of space, and that's something I think that we could all do. So yeah, I think we're gradually moving towards that. I think we're all very much aching to get back to this more normal way that we interact as people and as architects. I think we've got to provide more opportunities for users and for tenants to make their own mark, to personalize little nooks and corners in the building where someone could make a shop or a newsagent stand. As architects, I suppose the lesson is don't prescribe too much or fix too much in too much detail, because that's always very hard to make flexible, which I think is one of the themes we were talking about today.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, to build on your point, Andrew, I think there are two or three other things that I would add to it. I think the really important thing again is that a lot of times these buildings that have kind of large populations to them, the briefs that come out very often are kind of like a processing brief. That they're about throughput, and it's really important, I think, for us to always consider comfort and dignity. Actually, that I think you need to think that your journey is one that is pleasant and is dignified, rather than it's simply a kind of a conduit, a pass through, and that needs to. So the whole notion of human experience, I think, continuous human experience is vital. I think maybe what I think the post-COVID world may benefit from is an adjusted rather than a kind of a conforming relationship in terms of the working day. I think that I think we've got used to different modes of working. There is in many ways, I think what COVID has done is to create a far greater trust, I suppose, within the public sector and within the private sector, that people generally just want to be productive, but that actually, the way that some of the constraints of our lives, the other things that are going on, should be allowed to flex, so that the working day could flex as well. And that could take some of these stresses out of the transport interchanges as people move at different times of the day, to suit them rather than to suit a kind of preordained timetable. And I think the third thing that we're seeing within railway stations and potentially within airports is that because they are places of congregation and pass through, that there is greater opportunity for connection, and that if you then apply data and you apply very, very good wireless connectivity, these places can become kind of city exchanges. They can actually become places of either chance encounter, or they can become incubation spaces where businesses seek to meet at railway stations, at transportation hubs, at airports, rather than necessarily needing to going further into the city. And certainly when we were looking at work in Changi Airport in Singapore, there was the feeling that people could be visiting Singapore to meet without ever leaving the airport. That actually the city exists within the airport, if you like, rather than the airport being a gateway into the city. That you actually take the city and you put it into the airport, and it's a really interesting, I think, opportunity.
Yeah. I agree with you both, and I think something that is probably going to happen is once COVID is finally over, people are not probably going to be complaining about crowds in public transportation. They're going to be okay with it, embrace it actually, maybe for a few days, and then they'll go back to wanting their own personal space.
Indeed.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions here from the audience. There's one that says, structures like these are currently under major scrutiny given the world's current awareness of sustainability. Do you think we're doing enough?
So I think certainly countries in the world are getting more thoughtful and sustainable into how they do it. And a very good example of this is the Expo 2020. And as I said, that from day one, it was about how can this become something else? How can it be any type of building virtually? And making flexible buildings is one of the most sustainable things you can do, because if you don't have to rebuild, you've saved an absolutely staggering amount of embodied energy. So I think we are doing very well, especially in the UAE. I think we've become very conscious very, very quickly. I remember coming in 2004, and the pace was very rapid, and I think it was how to design sustainably was on the agenda, but it maybe wasn't given as much priority as it is now. You've got the government starting to introduce regulations, promoting it, and I think the UAE as well has got a number of really good initiatives to get people really thinking about it's the structure, but it's how that structure can be repurposed and also what supports it. So there's always more that can be done though. Olympics, as another example, it has slightly competing needs. I mean, it's very important for a country and for the world to come together and participate in these venues. And one has to think, well, the sports are very prescriptive. They do need these facilities. So the decision is usually made to build them. And that comes in the past, I think, with examples where they were far too rigid and they didn't really work. So we have made leaps and bounds there. I suppose the other thing, perhaps one last thing to think, just to make a note about is when you have to do something very, very prescriptive, let's say a very specific type of sport or a very specific type of event, the other way of thinking about it is how you can create temporary structures, which again can be repurposed and reused. And that can have a lot of cleverness to it. You can not just think about how materials can be recycled, but you could think about how whole components of that building could be repurposed and reassembled. So that's another way to look at it. So in short, getting there, but could do more.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the question is a fundamental one. We're not doing enough. I think there needs to be a very strong contemplation, I think, about as Andrew was saying, how buildings can be adjusted. I think right from the word go, I think we should think about how buildings and their elements can be dismantled once they meet an end of life. We also need to think, I think, about a restorative attitude that buildings and urbanism can have, whereby it's a sort of net contributor rather than just trying to minimize impact. And I do think that there is you've used this term, I think earlier, Nigel, where you spoke about the humility of architecture, and I think that's, for me, that's the fundamental. I think. And I said this to you earlier. I think Sharjah is, extraordinarily, whether it's an intentional skill or whether it's simply kind of part of the culture that's been adopted. But there is a sort of a modesty to a lot of the work that is going on in Sharjah, whereby it's not about the extravagant and it's not about the kind of a trophy architecture, which is very egotistical. For me, I think architecture has got to be humble in a way. It's got to try its hardest against a lot of challenges, and every decision that we make needs to be, we need to be concerned that that decision is correct rather than just assuming because we are the master architect it is correct. I think there's a really great place for humility at the moment, and I think that is it's a great strength, I think, to be humble. I think it's not a weakness. I think it's a strength, and I think that's kind of I think where we need to move to.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely our duty as architects to design responsibly, especially at this very pivotal times. It's great to hear all about these examples and thoughts you have regarding this. And I'm hoping, also the future generation and of architects would definitely think quite hardly before committing to a design. Thank you both for this very, very enlightening and interesting talk. I myself, I feel like it gave me an optimistic boost, and I would like to thank everyone also who joined us today on behalf of myself and the speakers and on behalf of Shuruq. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah, that's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Great. So just for next session in 2 weeks' time, our title is Modular Architecture. This is what we're going to be discussing. And until then, stay safe, everyone, and goodbye.